Hello, as always, I am Adam Dunstan. The topic for today is religion and spirituality in Cook Inlet today, diversity of devotions. When we talk of this, we are in a sense revisiting a theme from earlier in the semester when we talked about traditional and pre-colonial spiritual traditions in Cook Inlet among indigenous peoples. Here now, we will be talking about after 250 years of extensive change, where does religion and spirituality sit today in Cook Inlet? And that's an important topic because religion and spirituality are a really important type of diversity in Cook Inlet, right? We have many different faith traditions people come from, and some people come from no faith tradition, or are not religious or atheist. And so people come from many different paths, and that's part of the rich cultural diversity of our space. And so I'm hopeful that this lecture will be practical in that way for you, in better understanding the people around you, as always. Religion, as I'm using the term, as anthropologists use the term, is very broad and encompassing. It includes not just organized religion, which is sometimes what we use the term for in everyday English, but also all sorts of other different ways in which cultures approach, commune with, interact with what they perceive to be the supernatural. It does not need to be large religion, does not need to have a building, does not need to have a holy text. It simply needs to have people that are approaching the supernatural in a certain way. It tends to be based on the idea that the world is in need of some kind of healing or some kind of harmonization. Either a harmony has been lost and needs to be regained, or a harmony needs to be perpetuated. In either case, humans are involved in that complex interplay. The term religion itself is interesting. It comes from Latin religare, which means more or less to reunite or to bind together again. And for us as social scientists, that's kind of a nice etymology. That's a nice sort of implicit meaning to the term, because indeed, in many cultural traditions, religion is interwoven with all the other aspects of life. It's not necessarily something separate. It would not have necessarily been thought of that way. So when we speak of religion, then we're speaking of something that's, for many residents of Takatnu, pretty important. For other people, not important at all. It really depends. So first, we are going to talk about religion in general in Cook Inlet. And again, now that I've used defined the term, I hope you understand that religion encompasses not just organized religious organizations or affiliations, but also all sorts of different types of spirituality in general. So let's talk then about religion and spirituality in Cook Inlet. Sorry, that should say region, not religion. That is a typo. Let's fix it now so it does not afflict us to the end of all time. Okay. When you look at Alaska's religious statistics, and quick caveat, religious statistics are always going to be imperfect, among others because oftentimes surveys ask people to pick a specific religious identity, and nowadays people are more and more identifying with multiple religious identities. And also, there's always the inherent problems of different survey methods are better at capturing different parts of the population, and no survey method is perfect, especially not in a place with a lot of rural areas or areas lacking reliable internet access, like Alaska. Nonetheless, from what we can tell, when you look at Alaska's religious statistics and that of the broader US, it is pretty comparable in some ways. For example, about 2/3 of Alaskans identify as Christians. About 2/3 of the broader US identify as Christians. But in other ways, Alaska is very, very diverse religiously. Cook Inlet is. In part because Christianity itself is highly diverse in Cook Inlet. We have religious communities here that you may or may not see as much of in the lower 48, but you see having a very strong presence here. So for example, Russian Old Believers in Nikolaevsk and surrounding communities in the southern Kenai Peninsula, which we did a reading on. Or for that matter, the very large Russian Orthodox presence here. Other things as well, strong traditions of Alaska Native healing, strong presence of Mennonites among other groups. There's just a strong presence of Hmong religious practitioners. There's just an interesting interplay here. It's a lot more diverse maybe than the statistics at first suggest. I'd like to talk briefly first about Hmong spiritual healing. We did a reading about that, and so I don't want to add much to what the reading has already said, but to emphasize a few points that contextualize the reading. Number one, as we've said before, the Hmong community in Anchorage is quite large, at least from the perspective of other migrant groups. I think it was something like 1 in 100, so not small by any stretch. And not an insignificant percentage of those people are probably practicing traditional spiritual or religious practices, either in tandem with or more likely not in tandem with other religious traditions. And so, for example, in 2010, there was some data that suggested that across Hmong Americans in general, not just Alaska, but Hmong Americans in general, about 70% practice traditional religious practices. So you ought not to think that just because someone has emigrated to a primarily Christian area that they have necessarily adopted that. And the Hmong American community still has a strong continuity with past spiritual practices, although some have converted to Christianity. A large percentage still do engage in traditional practices as well, and again may do so in tandem. Some of the key themes of Hmong religious practice, among others, include ancestor veneration, the importance of the extended family from a spiritual perspective that continue to affect daily human life. Indeed, that is one of the ways in which diseases can happen, is something has caused disharmony among that extended family that extends into the world of spirits. Shamanic healing, people who can act as intermediaries with the spirit world to help people, to heal people who have gone through certain kinds of maladies caused by spirit loss or spirit problems. Again, the idea of spirit or spirits leaving the body as a result of shock being one of the better known examples for Hmong religion. Reincarnation, as with many of the South, Southeast, and East Asian faiths. And then spirit-related illness, so as we were just saying a minute ago. Now, within traditional Hmong practice, as I alluded to before in our lecture on relatives, there are a variety of ways of healing. One article that I read distinguished it into 4 types, although I've heard it as 3 instead. But shuaj, or herbal medicine, kub, healing incantations. They called it spells in the reading. I try to shy away from terms like spells. I think they can cause misunderstandings with because of popular media and the ways we think of spells in popular media. Kawyij, to scare evil spirits away. And then this word, which I will not attempt to pronounce, Txivneeb, but shamanic curing. Basically a shaman, a spiritual intermediary, figuring out what's going on and then doing a ceremony of healing. So as in many traditions, a Hmong shaman would be somebody who could interface with spirits that are causing spiritual issues and, among other things, return spirits to the bodies that they belong to, right? So if there's a spirit in the spirit among the dead spirits, or a ghost afflicting a living human being, and then that's causing them problems, the shaman can help to resolve the issues. Or if somebody has been frightened and their soul has departed, bringing that back together, reunification, as we were talking about before, a harmonization. Of course, we don't want to oversimplify this. As Hickman points out in his article, there's people who have really overly emphasized, perhaps, the degree of distinction between this healing system and the Western one, almost to the point where, right, it starts to sound like it would be really hard for those populations to interact with doctors and vice versa. Hickman points out that the people he had spoke to in Anchorage, who were Hmong, oftentimes had sort of meshed the two together in creative ways, where some diseases were attributed to like pathogens, and you go to a doctor for them, a lot of like common diseases, and then more unusual ones or severe ones, you tend to take to the shaman, and then if the shamanic healing doesn't work, you go see the doctor about it, and conversely, if the doctor healing doesn't work, the medicines, you go see a shaman about it. So we see, as we often do in cross-cultural contexts, people being pluralists, where we oftentimes think of religion as monolithic or healing as monolithic. In practice, we oftentimes see see people being creative pluralists, blending different things, trying different things out as they try to look after their own health, as indeed do a lot of people, whether or not religious healing is part of their kind of suite of healing practices. You may not be engaged in shamanic healing in addition to biomedical work, but for example, you might involve yourself both by going to sort of a conventional MD, but also a chiropractor, and potentially also using essential oils or following a specific kind of dietary regimen that you find to be helpful. There's blendings that we all do, particularly when we face chronic or serious issues. Moving on from Hmong faiths, as we look at the statistics, this is from the Pew Center. They published something called the Religious Landscape Survey. This was about 5 years ago, maybe closer to 7 now. Pew Center is some of our most comprehensive data about religious affiliation of people in the United States. They also have some great data more generally for the world that I will often reference. So when we look at that, they've also broken it down by state. And so this is for Alaska, and this is for the US. Typeface is a little small to try to get both of these in there, but again, Alaska, US in general. A few trends that you may notice as you're looking at them. Feel free to pause your video to get a closer look or look up the Pew Center data. One of the things that's unique about Alaska, and again, we want to always put in that caveat of Alaska's hard to survey, so take this as far as you will with it and take it with a grain of salt. But at least according to survey data, our percentage of Christians is lower. Not an insignificant percentage lower either. 70% among the US, 62% among Alaska. That may not sound like a lot, but by comparison, when the 2015 to 2020 data showed about a similar decline in Christianity across the country, that was like big news, at least for nerds like myself that follow religious demographics. And so, 70 versus 62%, that's a lot of people. That's in a place like the United States that represents millions of people who have, whether that's from people leaving a faith or not. So the fact that there's a difference here between the US and Alaska, is interesting. At the same time, it's still about 2/3, that's still a large number, but when you actually drill down into the specifics, there's some interesting trends here. One of them, and it's probably going to shock no one, given what we've talked about this whole semester, but is that the percentage of Catholics is a little lower, but the percentage of Orthodox Christians is much higher. About 1 in 200 people is Orthodox Christian. Eastern Orthodox is typically what that means, such as Greek or Russian Orthodox. That's about 1 in 200 people in the United States as a whole. In Alaska, that's about 1 in 20 people. So an entire magnitude differently, 10 times as many. So I put 5 times. I was incorrect. It is 10 times. So that's a lot. Let's just fix that real quick. I'd done the math wrong when I was calculating it. No one ever accused me of being great at math. The percentage of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, more colloquially known as Mormon, is also significantly higher than the United States. I put 5 times. That's a little bit of an overestimate. It was just to make the math easy for me. It's a little more like 3.5 times. But anyways, pretty significantly larger. I don't know how to account for that. There's a pretty strong present, well, other than to suggest that part of what's going on here is that Alaska, even if geographically we think of ourselves as the North, culturally, I think some folks in the lower 48 kind of resonate with Alaska as part of the West. I say this as somebody from the lower 48. And you get people moving from mountainous parts of the West with a lot of forest, like Utah, Idaho, Arizona, Oregon, places with reasonable percentages of LDS people. And then it's perhaps not shocking that those sorts of folks find themselves in Alaska in a pattern not entirely like the Hmong pattern we talked about before, of sort of seeking out topography that's somewhat familiar. The percentage of Russian Orthodox is much easier to explain, of course, with the historic presence of Russian colonialism historically, and then just a very large Russian American population to this day. Again, not to mention the Russian Old Believers, which you read about, which interestingly are not descendants of the original Russian settlers, as far as we know, but instead the Russian Old Believers come from a very different circuitous path of migration through a variety of locations in the Western Hemisphere, and eventually ending up in the Kenai Peninsula. So it's not actually, they went from Russia to a bunch of other places, then to Alaska, not Russia to Alaska. So that's different entirely than Russian Orthodox in general. And so you need to understand that Old Believer and Russian Orthodox are two different traditions within Russian Orthodoxy, within Eastern Orthodoxy. And although I didn't love the title used in that article about sort of like a 17th century Russian community, right? That's I do not like that. I mean, like, people like use tablets and stuff and like cell phones. It's like you see folks all the time here where I live. Like, that's very misleading to suggest that this is a community trapped in the past or something. But the headline is trying to get at, and what I think the article did a better job of getting at, is the fact that people practice Russian Orthodox, what they perceive as proper Russian Orthodoxy, going back centuries, right? And practices going back to before major reforms within Russian Orthodoxy that most Russian Orthodox people would be the inheritors of. So it's definitely a different branch, and a fascinating one, and an interesting part of our cultural diversity. Here in Kenai Peninsula, you go to a grocery store, you go to the park, and you see Old Believers not uncommonly, right? Folks that have driven up so that they can, probably from Nikolaevsk or other places in the southern peninsula, so that they can, whether it's grab a bite to eat or get some groceries or whatever it is, shopping in Kenai. Or maybe some folks do live close by, even if their, maybe parents live out in the southern communities. And so you see folks speaking Russian and wearing traditional Russian Old Believers clothes. And it's really cool, fascinating, beautiful part of the diversity here. So sometimes there's diversity that we're not fully paying attention to around us. Other interesting things about Alaska's Alaska's religion. One of them is that we have a rather higher percentage of unaffiliated people. So unaffiliated is kind of a catch-all in Pew Center data and religious surveys in general. It covers atheist and agnostic, but it also covers the nothing in particulars, which is actually the much larger group, which is further broken down, if you were to do the drop down, into people that don't identify as a specific religion, but religion's not very important to them, versus people that don't identify as a specific religion, but religion is important to them. So the latter, for example, people that might say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, or people that maybe they blend 3 different religious traditions and don't really identify as any one. So folks like that are kind of caught in that nothing in particular category, so it's diverse. It covers a lot of ground. There's pretty good reason to believe that a lot of this has grown in general, this category in the US, but it's already quite high in Alaska relative to the rest of the US at 31%, or about 1 in 3 people versus about 22%. So we have a large percentage of people who don't identify as a specific religion. It's a bit higher, a percentage of atheists and agnostics are pretty notably higher, but what's particularly striking what's the larger category there is nothing in particular. So interesting stuff here. Another thing to note is that we have a small but significantly higher percentage than the rest of the U.S. of Native American religion, quote unquote. That's put as 1% on the survey data. That's, I would think, an underestimate. And the reason I think it's an underestimate is that we have roughly 15 to 22% of the state that's Alaska Native. And traditional Alaska Native teachings and beliefs are not always co-exclusive with other religious identities, right? Somebody may be a baptized Christian, for example, but still remember the teachings of ancestors, still draw on them in different ways. There may even be examples, historically we've had examples such as some of the early members of the Alaska Federation or the Alaska Native Brotherhood, where, you had people that had come up through the Presbyterian school system, still identified as such, but also did religious ceremonies related to Tlingit culture. So there's blendings in different ways, and so the 1% is probably an underestimate, but even still it's much larger than the US in general. So that's interesting and not shocking given our large percentage of indigenous people. The other thing that's really interesting though, and maybe requires a little more explanation, is the larger percentage of Neo-Pagan and Wicca people. That's not a big category in the US or in Alaska. kind of a hard group to track for a variety of reasons, but generally have grown over time. Definitely. Pretty large growth, I would say, over the last couple of decades. But here in Alaska, that group stands at 1%, which might not sound like a lot, but that's about 1 in 100 people. So that's pretty significant. So another group that I wanted to talk about briefly is the Muslim community in Anchorage. So we have in Anchorage about 3,000 Muslims, and I think that's Anchorage Metro, not just literally Anchorage. I'm not sure whether or not they're including Palmer and Matsu, but 3,000 Muslims, and that accounts for about 1 in 100 residents. I think that's not counting Matsu. So yeah, Anchorage, broadly conceived, but not too broadly conceived, includes about 3,000 Muslims, or 1 in 100 people. That's not insignificant by any stretch, right? And, you know, there's some kind of unique, interesting challenges for Muslim people in general in Arctic regions. One of them is that the your prayers that you do, the salat, that it is in theory 5 times a day, and 2 of them are tied into sundown and sun up. That becomes a problem in places like Alaska or northern Russia. So instead, people probably are going off of what the time is in Mecca, or what the time is in whatever country they originated from, if they are from another country and were not born in the Arctic. Since we obviously, the sun plays tricks on us, as we like to say in my family, does funny things because of midnight sun and polar night. Another thing that they talked about in one of the readings that I had done, they talked about the difficulties in getting halal food sometimes, although recently Anchorage has seen the opening of at least a couple of options with halal food. But halal is sort of a dietary code, including the ways animals are killed. People talked about in that reading, even like one person had a hookup with a hunter who does halal butchering when he kills the meat, so he was able to like use that for breaking the fast during Ramadan. So kind of and then also like some people are used to spices and things from traditional meals for Ramadan that are not widely available in Alaska because of our location. So there's kind of complexities, little things people face, but we do have a pretty large Muslim community here at 1 in 100 people. As far as I know, there is only one mosque or masjid in Alaska, and that was built in 2016, and that is the Islamic Community Center. It is more than solely a mosque. I believe they have like a community garden there, for example, but it is a mosque, actively practicing mosque. This is from inside the mosque. People are spaced out. I think this was, during COVID, and so people are a little more spaced out than they normally would be for prayer services. So it's pretty comparable to the rest of the U.S., and the percentage of Jewish people is a little bit smaller. I said comparable. I mean comparable-ish, but it's like 1% versus 2%, right? So that's not really that comparable, but at least not like majorly different. But yeah, definitely a bit smaller. When it's down to numbers like 1%, though, I hesitate a little bit because of the difficulties of surveying. The sampling error becomes difficult. I also wanted to go back for a second to Neo-Paganism and Wicca in Alaska. Again, between 0.5% and 1% of people in Alaska. It's difficult to say the exact number of the active communities in Anchorage. Some religious traditions keep like exact records of whoever has been baptized in their faith. Wiccans do have covens, but that's not the same as all people who practice or engage in Wicca or other Neo-Pagan traditions in Anchorage. And so it's kind of difficult to track that. In one of the readings, you could go to something like the Alaskan Pagan Community Center, which is one of our, it's north of Anchorage, and it's in Willow, and it's sort of a gathering place for Neo-Pagan and Wiccan people in Alaska. They have a few hundred people that are following them, so that would suggest a community of a few hundred people. They threw a sort of a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, but not tongue-in-cheek, which is ball in Anchorage back in 2013. Sorry. Some people from the local Wiccan community, including High Priestess Wright, had said this is to honor Samhain, which is a really important part of the calendrical ceremonies. So Wicca is in part built around calendrical ceremonies that honor different passages of the earth through different parts of its seasonal cycle throughout the year. It's also built partly on the idea of a duality of the divine, of both male and female aspects, who are more venerated in different ceremonies throughout the year. And so that's part of Wicca. And so Samhain's an important ceremony and part of that around the time of Halloween. And so the popular US holiday. And so Samhain, though, they threw a ball for this dance for people, and there was hundreds of people interested in it. So again, that suggests a community of hundreds of people. I said a second ago that it was a little tongue-in-cheek. People, there were some, people doing like witches' hats and things like that at the ball. Some Wiccans, and they were making fun of the stereotypes, right? They were poking fun at some of the stereotypes people have about Wiccans. But yeah, it's sort of a community of practice of people engaging in various practices of earth veneration, of deity veneration connected to the earth, of ceremonies. Yeah, Neo-Paganism definitely has a presence here in Alaska. And I think that that's interesting, and I think that that's perhaps not entirely surprising. If I was to do some armchair theorizing, people oftentimes move to Alaska or stay in Alaska because of a deep connection to the environment. It's not surprising then that a tradition which not always, but oftentimes has kind of strong ecological overtones has got a bit of a higher following here in Anchorage and in Alaska in general. That kind of makes sense. So that's a bit about the rich and beautiful diversity we have of different spiritual traditions here in Alaska. There's so much more I could cover. I barely scratched the surface, but I wanted to include a few kind of ones that I knew about that I thought were interesting.